everybody for coming in. It's a real pleasure to welcome Brad Klofel to the AA. Brad established Allied Works Architecture a little over 15 years ago in 1994 and quickly established a very strong reputation with a kind of experimental project called the Sidings Project, conceptual designs for 5 different sites in his native Pacific Northwest, where Brad initially established the office in Portland in the mid-1990s and gained widespread attention for a first early project finished in about the year 2000 for the well-known advertising agency Wieden & Kennedy, and completed his first major freestanding building in the Midwest in St. Louis, the Contemporary Art Museum, published and presented around the world and then finished in 2003. And Allied Works has gone on and gained great recognition and notoriety for a combination of, I think, incredibly dramatic moving spaces which marry an interest in contemporary craft and detail with principles of modern design and detailing, which are incredibly striking and compelling examples of work that began in those early experiments in the 1990s. Today, Allied Works is an East Coast and West Coast combination office, and Brad moves between the 2 settings in New York City and Portland, and has recently begun the first of his international projects, is working in Canada and Calgary for a National Music Center, and I think you might show some of that tonight. Yeah, super. And has over the years led design teams in 100 or more proposals, making institutional and other projects in places like Berkeley, in Quebec, in Virginia, in Texas, and many other settings. Brad studied at the University of Oregon, where I once was many years ago, and went on from there to the East Coast. And by the way, it's a real pleasure to keep the Oregon-London connection going in the form of this talk tonight. He's been a teacher and guest professor at Rice University, at the University of California, Berkeley, at Syracuse at the University of Oregon, and at Columbia, where he was a teaching assistant of Ken Frampton's while he was studying there. And tonight's lecture coincides with the launch of his new book titled Occupation, copies of which will be in the rear room there in the South Jury Room after the talk. Fantastic book by Hotche Kantz, the fantastic European book publisher, which has gone out of their way to make an incredible document of the first 15 years of work of the office, a beautiful book that combines a series of conversations with artists, scientists, photographers, makers, craftspeople of different kinds, with the collaborative team that have done the projects that it documents. Please join me in welcoming Brad Klofel.
All right. So I gave away the video. The video. Oh, that was the Brett feedback. How's the sound? Better. All right. Brett gave away the video at the introduction of the show here, but I'll dive in. So occupation. I'm intrigued, and it may come from being an architect in the Western United States, certainly my origins, with this notion of occupation more as an idea of holding ground, of somehow establishing domain, of providing some kind of concentration or clarification, a way of architecture providing distinction, I think. All of those words, I sort of search for those words as a way to describe what I think architecture uniquely can do, and we'll get more into that as we move on. But occupation is a concentration of forces, a concentration of energy, concentration of labor and economy as well. And it's interesting, again, belying my Western origins, the way that we treat land, the way that we treat the earth, and whether that earth is the city, the suburbs, or rural environment, the kind of there's a conceptual premise, albeit an unconscious or subversive conceptual presence, I think, that that landscape is a leftover thing. It's the space between buildings. It's the domain between the curb and the street. It's a residual that in fact, in many ways, I think right now in architecture and in contemporary architecture, and certainly in practice, space is residual. The landscape is occupied by objects, exclusive objects that are self-referential. So this idea that or the possibility that there are conditions that exist that create specific ways of inhabiting, specific ways of building, specific ways of seeing. You know, looking at inside, this fantastic photo of these bromeliads sort of gathering together their own ecology on this line in Colombia. The idea that conditions exist, conditions pre-exist in architecture, or that the pre-existing conditions create a determined architecture and a determined set of relationships. And that there's a way then of inhabiting that. I think this is the artist Verini, I believe is his name, right? As well as, what's his name? Wolfgang Laib. I don't know if you know his work. He gathers pollen in this particular piece, this room of light that he creates. He gathers pollen from the local environment and then creates this space out of the pollen. So it's innately linked to the specifics of that location where he installs the piece and then creates something entirely new. But this notion of making, this notion of occupation through various acts that are specific to this condition, obviously this is a mineral condition in the western United States, and the level of insight that it takes to determine those conditions. And I think that's an important point for me to make, that there's, that to create work that is a conditional response, to use the word on the title, to create work that can only happen there. And when I mean only happen there, this is not about contextual response. It could be institutional response, cultural response, economic response, environmental response, any of those things. But the idea of a conventional response means that that act of making, ideally, comes out of some insight that only happens in that particular place. In some ways, it's approaching a project or a problem or a site without preconditions, without preconceptions, and allowing oneself to see what architecture is there. This photograph of a Native American bridge, one of the most amazing acts of making and engineering I've ever seen. Can you imagine the trial and error of sliding those logs out and wrapping those things to actually bridge that? You know, that's without any computational skills, without any modeling, but strictly trial and error. And this idea that conditions exist that create radical responses, that in this maple tree completely covered in moss, you know, the tree is obscured and the moss becomes the form and the body, and that natural forces as well as cultural forces create such specific opportunities. This is a photo I took landing in Fort Myers, no, is that right? Fort Myers, Florida. I've never been to Florida. And there's these memories of lowland wetlands that have then inspired, I guess, perhaps, inspired a particular species of cypress to grow in them. And so now the wetlands are gone, and you just have these circles, they're called cypress mounds, that dot the landscape of this specific species. And again, the specificity of the response. I look at landscape in that way. There are a lot of landscape examples. And I look at landscape and then I suppose the work of artists because of the clarity and the preciseness of those relationships, the sort of cause and effect and the kind of seeking and responding. This is Richard Long Wind Circle. I don't know if you know Richard Long's work, an artist in the 70s and 80s. I know he's still practicing. I saw a piece of his the other day. His first pieces, he would establish, or he would venture on walks through the landscape. And on those 30 and 45-mile walks, he would discover certain things that intrigued him and certain relationships and would make art out of those things. Oftentimes it was rocks. You can see them. I'm sure you've seen them in galleries and now today. But the beginning of those was they were found conditions that he would create and then move on and then seek another set of conditions or possibility. And the idea of accumulation, I think it's interesting when you think how we occupy space, how we as a culture occupy our physical environments. This idea of accumulation, that there's conditions that exist that gather things into and around them, and then we as makers, we as, I guess, Western culture, tend to define our relationship by what we accumulate. And in this case, yeah, I don't think there can be a more American landscape. I have no idea where that is, but it could be absolutely anywhere. That we establish our relationship with the world, in this case our physical relationship, by our relationships with the objects that we gather around us, and thereby create some sense of reference, some sense of distinction, filtered through those objects which are ours. And I think a lot of the goal is to create a here and a there, to get back to this idea of domain, to holding our place in the world, to establishing some kind of limits that create an order or a perceived order. I love this photo that I took in Basel last year, where this entire ecosystem was created in this very toxic environment by the leftover residues of the train and the iron. And again, one specific species. But that idea of distinction is a way, I think, and I think it's actually this notion of distinction is something that architecture does very, very well. That it has the possibility to render some level of insight, some level of discernment to clarify conditions and to clarify relationships. The Marehill Overlook that Brent mentioned was the very first project that we did, part of the Sidings project, where I went back to the West Coast from New York and looking at that powerful landscape that I knew so well, thought that it would be interesting to propose 5 different sites: city, suburban, rural, rural, forest, and desert, and to propose that if one was to build in those places, one would build in radically different ways, because those places carry an inherent architecture or an inherent possibility of architecture that by building we can somehow investigate and create some discussion with. So in these foothills above the Columbia Gorge, the Klickitat Hills, they're enormous landscape. This very first piece that I got to investigate, we got highway interpretive funds from the State Highway Department to build this. It was quite incredible. I think they had no idea what they were really funding. So this is an interpretive site for the highway. But it allowed us and allowed me to think of how one would begin to mark that landscape. A very elemental way of building. There was only $150,000. God knows, what's that, 90,000 pounds or something like that. Very little bit of money, and so we concentrated the forces both of building and making and the forces of money to create this 150-foot long ribbon of concrete. And essentially for me, I learned a tremendous amount from this piece actually, is how one can make something perceivable in that enormous landscape where built works virtually do not matter. And can one make a place that provides some kind of reference between the infinite and we as humans, we as physical entities, our bodies, and this 150-foot long, 8-inch slab, 8 feet wide, became a wall that one could occupy that would frame views, provide scale references, change with light and shadows. I mean, it became the act that then had multiple interpretations, multiple readings, multiple forms of occupation. The Dutchess County Residence is a small house that we just finished in upstate New York, where we're doing an art barn, a guest house, a main house, which I'll show you the project for. It's under construction. The guest house was the first time. Those are the 3 sites, with the guest house being to the lower right there. It was the first time I was able to build in a deciduous forest. And when you come from the Pacific Northwest, the conifer forests are these dark, foreboding, lightless, somewhat terrifying and awe-inspiring things. And deciduous forests, in opposition, are actually filled with light. So, I think this might be the main house. So we did 3 different projects, like I said. The main house is up on a knoll. That's actually a piece by Roxy Payne, which is out at the farthest end of the view in the meadows. And the main house attempts to locate itself in that meadow. It has tremendous views of the Catskill Mountains to the east and the north. So the first act of occupation, of trying to create a location, and it's interesting because housing is such a different thing. Housing is really bridging, especially housing in these powerful landscapes in the United States. Housing is bridging this enormously scaled environment with this intimate activity of dwelling. And so how does one bridge those scales? And for me, it was the first act was the earthworks. These are 200 or 300 foot long courtyards cut into the earth, fieldstone walls, and then the house, so it created an intermediary site in that meadow, trying to tether the house to the world in some way, if you will. And then the house became the knot or the loop that tied those things together with the landscape. The house is primarily glass because of the view. So it is in contrast to the earth, up in this meadow, surrounded by tremendous views. And the tension between those two forms of making, the steel and glass and the cutting of the ground of the stone, create, I hope, some sense of specificity that we'll see as the house gets completed. Oh, another very exciting thing about this house, and this started, or I should say, this resolved some of the conversations that had begun in some of the art museums that we've done. This piece, the owners are tremendous contemporary art collectors, and they've asked various people, Saul LeWitt, Yepahine, I can't even remember. I mean, they collect art like we buy breakfast cereal, essentially. Tremendously important art, too. Well, they hired the artist Doug Aiken to do a piece on the site. They have 400 acres that we've sited this work on. He walked the site and wanted to meet me. We sat down and we talked about this house that is sort of there and not there in that incredible landscape. And he proposed that the house become his site, which was absolutely thrilling. And so for 2 years, this is his proposal. For 2 years, he filmed the site without the house in all different weather, all different proximities, close and far. And then when the house is done, and the sun goes down, projectors come on that project on all four sides of the house. So this ambiguous sense of place that we were creating with this glass house is extended through the dialogue with the art. And for me, I think the most exciting insight of that piece was understanding that the conversation that I had started with architecture had its limits, that it could only go so far. But the idea could be extended by this act of art and sort of transformed and extended in different ways. And it's just going to be an incredible piece. It's called Lighthouse. And the house will be done, if we're lucky, in a year. Different ways of binding oneself to the world, binding oneself to the site, whether that site is a landscape or a building, or whether that site's an institution. This is a competition that we won 3 or 4 years ago. It was stalled by the New York legislature. But the city of New York is planning a park, or is in the process of completing a park all the way around the perimeter of New York. The UN wanted to build a new building, so to build a new building, they had to build a 1.5 mile connection in that landscape. So very political negotiation with the city and the legislature. But so we won the competition to link the city to the river across FDR Drive, and then to link 1.5 miles of this walk, of the river walk in the city. So there was a 65 feet in drop by the time you move up over FDR, and then trying to get people down in bicycles and other forms of transportation to this loop of a park. These were the concept models. So really binding the city to the river, and there's some amazing analysis drawings that we did along with that. This is another project, competition that we're in the finals for a museum in the Midwest, and it's a museum for, I guess you would call it primitive art. I think they call it environment makers. There's all these politically correct terms for these forms of art. In this tremendously powerful landscape of the Midwest, rural landscape, how to create there, we proposed in this open field to concentrate different forms of vegetation indicated by the laminations of the base model, and then gather them together in fieldstone walls, and then create this luminous light that would fill these pieces. A lot of the art is big site-specific stuff, so in those courtyards will be these enormous site installations, and then the other pieces of art that need protection from light and the elements are located under those shells. But different ways of stitching together place, of creating those mid-ground kinds of sites. This is the guest house that I mentioned earlier on the site, and it's down in that forest. And again, luminosity is the first thing that comes to mind as light filters through. It is almost amplified by the leaves. And then that infinite sense of the trunks themselves. I mean, there's such a powerful sense of place and transparency and the infinite that all we hope to do, and all I hope to do in that project, was to gather together some sense of how one might occupy that forest and to use an 8-inch steel tube frame as the first act of making, that those frames that wandered through those trees would begin to make the site then for the subsequent dwelling. And the house itself is then infilled with two simple acts of glass, one transparent, one's opaque, mahogany walls, glass walls that sort of rattle around in that frame to reinforce that sense of ambiguous boundary. The frame itself is actually two inverted cantilevers. I don't know if you noted, there's some structural shenanigans going on in the model, and we can talk about structure a little bit coming up. But with the whole intent, I think seems very clear, hopefully with the concept model, right, that one honors that place by creating that sense of ambiguity of boundary and the kind of tenuousness of occupation. The frame itself floats above the earth at cantilevers about 1.5 feet above. Michael van Valkenburg planted that amazing meadow of ferns that the structure flies through, and then I think that's the subsequent. And the infill then, absolutely, I mean, we did this crazy piece of construction. The frame itself is brought in sections. This is just from details of making, was brought in sections, welded, and then the whole thing was bondoed. We had auto body folks bondoing. This is very low tech making. Auto body folks bondo it, sand it, paint it, and create that monolithic piece of construction. I guess one of the most exciting things about working in the United States too is the diversity of the landscape and the diversity of the urban landscape. The St. Louis Art Museum, Contemporary Art Museum, was the first museum project that we commissioned. It was the first project outside of Oregon, actually. The finalists were, let's see, Rem Koolhaas was collaborating with Herzog and de Biron. Everybody was clamoring for this project because it was right next to the Ondo Pulitzer Foundation. So all of the boys were in the hunt for this one. And I bring that up only because because I think what was most compelling about the site wasn't the proximity to this beautiful piece of architecture, which is the Tao Ondo Pulitzer Foundation, but the location in this incredibly particular American landscape. There's an anecdote, which I probably shouldn't tell, but when Peter Zumthor came to see the site, he flew in, got in the car, got out of the car at the site, which is this, right to this, told the client that he felt absolutely nothing for this landscape, got in the car and flew home. Which is understandable. I mean, it's not a critique by any means, because it's a terrifying, sort of placeless and bizarre, but incredibly beautiful landscape. I commissioned an artist, Vicky Sambonaris, to go visit all of our sites and shoot the sites, not the building, because I think you can tell from the talk that this is where the buildings begin for me. And so, this photo is what I was given. This site is what I was given. This very, very American, Rust Belt, post-industrial landscape. And how does one begin to build there? How does one begin to build a space for art? This is a contemporary art museum that has no collection. So you're building a space that's for the potential of art in a city that's for the potential of urbanity in some idealized future that we'll never see, right? And it's a sort of a catalyst building of sorts. But for me, I wanted the building certainly to be a proposition in that way or aspirational in that way, but also be a celebration of what an amazingly particular landscape that is. Yeah, this is after the building's built. You can see what an impact it's had on economic development. It's an incredible thing. But so, how to create a there in something, in a situation like that? To create a boundary, because domains for art are bounded in precious locations by the nature of protecting art, right? They're there to sort of exclude forces, to allow the public in, to create some level of control for artists. So began the investigation with a wall, a simple wall that would establish some limits of the street again, the street that doesn't really exist as a spatial domain, and yet folded into the site to blur that sense of public and private and beginning and end. And then with a second order of concrete that moved over that and cantilevered over that, those two ribbons of concrete, establishing a clear sense of boundary, but then by the way they invert both materially and spatially, gathered or pull the site or pull the public into that site. The courtyard between the two, there's this amazing hinge piece by Richard Serra, a tilted spiral between the Ondo and the Contemporary. And then the two modes of making. The ground floor, 12-foot high concrete walls that go, I think in this case, east-west. The 18-foot high concrete walls then cross those 75-foot spans, 68-foot cantilevers. And in that 18-foot high height, they have the structural ability to do that. And then the roofs float in between those to create different scales of spaces and different qualities of light. Very, very inexpensive building, like unbelievably inexpensive building. It's an emerging art institution. It was about $8 million for the construction itself, which is hard to believe, about $225 a square foot. So there was really only three things we could do. There was the stainless steel mesh, the concrete, the glass, and the plaster ceilings. And that limited palette then, we sought to create a sense of transparency that existing site has with those open fields of grass. And then, like I said, use those planes that span in between those to begin to create more intermediate or more mediated spaces for art. There are clear stories that let north light in where the art is and the south light in where people are, so those roofs move up and down. And again, it was really intended to create a curatorial palette of some kind. But the space flows entirely through the building. So where it's prevented at the lower floor, it's allowed on the upper floors. There's stainless steel mesh that's on the outside sometimes and on the inside sometimes. Has to do with where the insulation is. When the art walls are on the inside, the concrete is exposed on the outside. When the insulation and waterproofing is on the outside, the concrete's exposed on the inside. And thereby, again, inverting that sense of inside and out. And it's a sort of ribbon house of cards, if you will. And it's exciting. It's very interesting because you can imagine as my first institutional project, I wanted to have a tremendous amount more of architecture there and a tremendous amount of control and detailing that the budget would not allow. And for me, it was the first time I was really confronted with not only those particular cultural limits, but also the limits of what architecture could communicate. And what I discovered in that process was then the things that I wanted the architecture to do would have to be completed by the art. Right? Is that the scaling devices would be the art. And sometimes the scale doesn't work, which I think that particular photo shows. The space is too big for that art. Obviously would either need more walls or not. And then sometimes the space would sort of snap together depending on the installation. And I realized in this case that what I was creating, and this is long before the Doug Aitken piece. The Doug Aitken piece comes sort of at the end of the discussion in some way. What I was really creating was a piece that only the art would complete. And that the architecture sets up a condition that necessitates the occupation of art for it to really make sense and to bridge that scale between the urban, the sort of terrifying urbanity of St. Louis, Missouri, and to a place where you can come to some level of repose and have a physical relationship with those pieces of art. The Musée National, or the Quebec, was a competition that we were in the last spring. An amazing site on the Fields of Abraham, which is this National Historic Site where the British defeated the French, and thereby Canada became a colony, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a tremendously important cultural site for Canadian history. The musée occupies buildings deep within the site. You see the old prison, that's at the top right there. And wanted a building that would become a pavilion on the street that would link the park with the Grande Allée, which is the street that you see out front. Purchased the red brick building, which is a Dominican convent next to the cathedral, and had an international competition. So the the site was charged from various forces. It needed to have a front door, it needed to sort of pull the institution, which are those two buildings at the bottom of the page, to the city, and then allow some connection. We couldn't build outside the footprint of couldn't cantilever, couldn't do anything over that site itself, but create some sense of transparency to the park. So we sought a form that would try to do everything at once, would try to create a bridge, would sort of weave itself into that site spatially, create gorgeous galleries of natural light, scale, create a rhythm and a scale and a processional that one could move through to connect deep into the park. And what we do at Allied Works that you probably are beginning to see here is those acts of making begin with a sense of structure. I mean, structure is that scale, that scale that can link, and I think does link, the city to certain activities, the landscape to certain activity. It's that bridging mechanism. It's something that's not completed itself, I think, for a lot of forms of occupation, but it is the first act that then becomes that mechanism and spatial, perceptual, experiential bridge. This is the concept sketch of mine, and then the concept model itself, basically interlocking rhythms of cantilever concrete that lift off of the ground of the park and are woven back together with these arced reinforced shells that bring the natural light into the galleries, which you'll see in a moment. And so that simple act really became a braid. I mean, it became a braid and a bridge between the city and the park, between the light and the art, between the park and the individual. The facade you can actually see through. You can see all the way through the building, through those interlocking cantilevers, which you'll see in a moment. So there's the marking the earth and tunneling through to the other buildings. There's those, 8 different shells, different U's that touch, and then the binding back together with the structure. And so these are some enormous spans and cantilevers and transfers that you see going on of 75, 80 feet. And you see how little the building actually touches the ground. So these are big concrete walls, 3 stories high, 35 feet, that can move up and around. They get braced then by the floors above, and there's a sort of whole structural narrative that goes with this, but creating essentially a pavilion. And the light is pulled down into those top galleries, down into the spaces below, with those huge shells that weave the project back together. Amendment. For some reason, what's interesting, amendment can be applied to existing buildings, existing sites. In this particular case, we'll talk about a few projects that had very, very specific given conditions, which then one had to modify. And it's an interesting dialogue for me, whether a site in the act of amending a site, whether a building, the act of amending the building. But that process of taking something and re-rendering its condition, we were asked by Max Protech, I think, 2 months after 9/11, to join a show of work looking at what one would propose for that site. I went down into the earth, looking at a way of occupying that entire 16 acres in a single act of making, creating a courtyard for cultural buildings, but trying to repair that place physically, bring it back to the earth, to the ground, not reassert its former presence. We won a competition in the fall for another form of amendment, which is a park that bridges an interstate freeway in Vancouver, Washington. On the right, a historic landscape, which was Fort Vancouver, where Lewis and Clark camped at the end of the Oregon Trail. On the left, the city of Vancouver, cut in the late 60s by an interstate freeway, forever separated, and they had a competition to try to join those things back together. And the competition brief, I think, called for a bridge and a platform and a park. And what we did in conjunction with Catherine Gustafson, I guess Gustafson Porter here, right, was to remake the earth. Sort of, look at the history of the earth in the Columbia Gorge, in that region. And we came upon these forms of landscape which are lava tubes, where the lava moved underground, created these chambers of gas, and then became opened up and eroded. These are spectacular things. And so look to those forms of landscape and the kind of memory of those landscapes 75 miles up the river to think of creating some new sense of archaeology, which would maybe create some sense of this incredibly violent act that the roadway was to the city itself. Museum of Arts and Design, another form of amendment. This was an existing building on Columbus Circle, competition that we won in 2002, with a building that could not be torn down, could not be added onto, whose form could not be modified. So the site itself was that piece, was that physical piece. And it's interesting, in the beginning, doing the research, we understood or we learned that the building was essentially one solid piece of site cast concrete. That it's essentially a kind of hollow mass, very little natural light. And when stripped of the iconography of this kind of transitional historicism, the building itself was really almost a void, or a solid in some ways, a spatial solid. And so the opportunity existed to open that back up. I mean, with the collection of objects, Museum of Arts and Design, mostly glass, steel, wood, ceramics, durable objects, we could bring in a tremendous amount of natural light. Also with that position, iconic position on Columbus Circle, the views afforded by that building were spectacular. I mean, it is really a compass point. So these are the first concept sketches I did before the interview, actually, is how does one begin in the site cast bearing structure to render it in a way to bring in natural light? How does one create a figure in there, some narrative, some way of bringing life to that building that exists, that's new life? And we arrived at a place that was very, very simple. The square footage of the building is about 4,400 square feet, tiny little floor plates. The structure spans from the perimeter to the existing core, so nothing could even be moved inside. So to create a sense of continuity of experience, to create a sense of connection, to fill the place with light, we ended up performing one act of architecture, a 2-foot continuous cut. And on the lower floors, it's 2 feet because that's the scale of your body as you stand and look out, the kind of light that we needed to bring in with working with light engineers. And then it expands to wider cuts in the classrooms and conference rooms and cafe as it moves up. The other thing that the 2-foot cut did was take a bearing wall and create cantilevers. It sort of restructured. So not only did it recreate the spatial sense of the building, but it recreated the structure of the building at the same time. Because those concrete walls were so deep, 16-foot floor to floor, we could cut them for 30 and 40 feet, and they would cantilever just with the existing structure they had in them. So it's almost like with that 2-foot cut, we sort of pulled the stitch out of the sweater, and yet the building is still standing in some way. And so the building that was solid and introverted became completely open and transparent and extroverted. So we created an internal act to try to unify the gallery experience. So you'd see people walking across the cuts, you'd see down where you were from, see back to the city and get re-referenced. We also wanted to exploit the potential of this site in its position on Columbus Circle. It's one of the few sites in the city that receives light on 4 sides. So we chose to explore a material that would take that light and give it back to the city in some way, that it would re-reference itself and re-render the building, and that the building would change over time, so that as you saw it in the morning or in the evening or different seasons or from different angles, the color would change, the complete quality of the building was changed. And we worked with Royal Titulaar in Mokum in Amsterdam for about 2.5 years, frankly, to create an iridescent glaze for architecture. A glaze that has no pigment, and we chose a glaze that has white only as its color, and we chose white to extend the memory of the white marble building that was there before, so that from a distance, glancing down Broadway or West End Avenue or anything else, you'd see this sort of ghost of the building, a kind of white form that carried forward that memory of the existing building. But then as you got closer, and different times of the day, different angles, like I mentioned, the quality of the building would change. And so it investigates those issues of distance and nearness through the very choice of the material of clay and the opportunity then to bring that glaze into the discussion. We opened up the ground floor, which wasn't before, tried to render it as transparent as possible, and then again, each of the floors cut with those very simple bands of concrete that go from the core along the floor, up the wall, across the ceiling, and back. So that's a continual act. Sometimes it's a site for art, which is very, very exciting. And then it connects you back to the city in ways. It's interesting, again, I think, in a kind of inverted way to St. Louis, where St. Louis does it with walls, and in this case, we do it by taking away material. In fact, it's really exciting to me that all we did, recladding the building aside, was remove architecture. I mean, it's really an act of editing. We didn't really add anything at all. We just took things away. And it took us a hell of a long time to figure that out. But it's exciting to think that architecture can be made by removal, not just by adding and making, or that you remake something by removing something. And then obviously the connection is back to the city. University of Michigan Museum of Art, on an amazing pastoral American campus, the last building site in the historic heart of the campus, in addition to an historic building, the Alumni Memorial Hall, which is the light gray building to the bottom. We were asked to, again, try to open that building up, to create some place that would invite students into the campus. The site itself is on the Diag, where 10,000, God, more than that, thousands of students a day walk by, going from the student union. And so again, how to occupy that site, how to open up the building, how to investigate that particular landscape, this American campus landscape. The building was formed by 3 enormous concrete cantilevers that create 3 courtyards then on the outside. And those 3 concrete cantilevers are enclosed by steel and glass structure that connect you to the landscape, that create the light for the galleries. And the building touches down then again in that absolutely physical. I think the foundations go down about 150 feet. The pilings, yeah, Michigan is sand. So creates a very light touch on the landscape itself. The building goes down to the ground where the existing building is 6 feet off the ground, hovers above the earth, creates that tension with that pastoral landscape, and allows the space of campus to slip and slide under it, and then presents the museum itself back to the campus. The translucent glass in those structural shells mediates light into the galleries, but then where the stairs come to the surface are as clear glass, so you see as people go through the galleries, they come to the edge, move back up and out, and then the primary cantilever at the ground floor rotating gallery, so those thousands of students that go by, although they must all be on vacation in this particular case, look into this contemporary rotating gallery, brings the art right to the street in this particular case. We also renovated and restored the historic building. In connecting the floor to floors, we were able to do some shenanigans with the sections and created another floor that then required a central space to unify it all together. There's a vertical gallery in the center between these 3 wings, 2 of which have different floor-to-floor heights than the third, and all of which open up into that space and pinwheel around it. Each floor facing a different outdoor court. You can enter the court. You can enter the building from 3 different points. And as I mentioned, when you come to the perimeter, you get reconnected back to campus and the natural light, and then back into these worlds of diffused light and interlocking space. Embedment. Wieden & Kennedy was the very first project. I had 2 employees when I got a call from this client. I had just completed designing a bar. So this is where it should all begin for you guys. Take that project of that bar. In fact, the bar that we designed, my fees were in kind. So I designed this bar for booze essentially, and it got me a $30 million project. So take those booze fees, and the future is yours. So Wieden & Kennedy was an existing building, 200-foot square block in Portland, Oregon. Historic building. Actually, it was a building in ruin. This is it before it was in ruin, but it was a building in ruin that we then took back on the historic register. But a 200 square foot building, 200 by 200 foot building, 5 stories high, heavy timber structure, brick building that had been a cold storage building, and thereby through freeze-thaw cycles had basically turned to dust. But the way the taxes are in the United States, you have to save that building and put it on the National Historic Register made more sense than tearing it down. So what we did was build a new building inside the old building. And we built the new building in the old building for functions that couldn't be accommodated by the 16-foot square timber grid. But we also built a new building that would structurally hold up the old building, since the old building had no structural or certainly no seismic capacity. So how one re-rendered that building? We embedded this building, this 5-story concrete structure, 80 by 100 5-story concrete structure within the old building, and then we demolished a hole, built this building, and then tied the existing building back to it. The 85 by 100 foot room itself is occupied by a series of transfer beams that hold all the connecting platforms, walk, auditorium, gymnasium, all of those variously scaled public and communal spaces that wouldn't fit within the historic piece. These walls gather together all of the structural forces by tabs that connect back through with the floor plates. Each floor is different. The room itself becomes a light filter that filters light down the 5 stories in space. And then there's a 400-person gathering and auditorium space in the center of this advertising agency, which then became one of the most civic places in the city of Portland. Portland's a small city of about 1.5 million people, and this is now a space that is used for art and music and nonprofits and all kinds of activities. We closed the hole with these 100-foot glulam beams and a penthouse structure that filters the light then through. It's basically a structural light louver that filters it down through this common space. The building itself, the space itself is surrounded by workspace, has various levels of privacy and opening. The left image is when you walk in and up off the street, looking up into that sort of jungle gym of beams and platforms, and then looking down from above, seeing the kind of compression of those zones that allow for that natural light. I mean, natural light is sacred in Oregon, and so trying to get the light to filter down through that space and create that quality of basically a civic center in the heart of a block. I think just two more projects. The Clifford Still Museum is under construction. It's a museum in Denver, Colorado, which, contrary to common mythology, is a prairie city, not a mountain city. It receives 300 days of sunlight a year. So it's a really harsh, incredibly beautiful landscape. And then, of course, in an urban landscape that's quite contrary, one might say, to that. It has a Gio Ponti building on the upper left, which is the original art museum. The Daniel Libeskind edition, which is the building that's all shoulders and elbows, which you can recognize. And then Michael Graves' library above. And we were given the site just to the left, above that parking lot, for this very small building to a mid-century American artist who quit selling his art in the mid-'70s, was a tremendously well-known painter, the same period as Barnett Newman and Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock. If you believe the writing was the most respected among the artists, and as many of those artists in the 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, hated the institution of the museum, said, I will not sell, sold 250 paintings and kept 3,000 other paintings and drawings. And when he died, his will declared that if a city would build a museum for my work, I'll give all my work to them. So the city of Denver got to the widow right before the end and got $2.2 billion worth of art given to them. And so we again, international competition. Small building, it's about 26,000 square feet. The mass of the building absolutely fills out the land that was given to us by the city, but we were also allowed to design the forecourt above it. The nature of that site, with these kind of absolutely expansive pieces of architecture, big narrative architectures, declarative, self-referential pieces of architecture around us, a building for a particular artist like Clyfford Still, sort of visceral, powerful work, which you'll see in a minute in some of the walkthroughs. I wanted to bring the building back to the earth, to sort of both in some way to re-reference the entire landscape relative to the exuberance all around us, but also to bring that light back to that surface of the prairie that you saw in the photo. So this was a concept sketch in the very beginning of wanting the building to sort of dwell in the earth somehow, to bury itself in the earth. This is the model that we took to the interview with the forecourt and the building, conceiving of it as some sort of monolith that one would bring then light, carve light into, bring light into that place, trying to create a relationship with the earth, a sense of pressure, if you will, and then thinking of the landscape as that, the building having the possibility of mass, and both in its material and in its quality of light, and then thinking of the landscape as an extension of that mass, we embedded the building in a grove of trees so that one never sees the facade of the building clear. In summer, when the trees are full grown, which will take some time, obviously, you'll sort of discover the building under the canopy of the trees and move through the canopy and into the building itself. Schematic design model trying to catch that quality, also thinking of the building itself being rendered by natural light, that in some ideal sense the building would appear only in shadow through the trees and kind of come and go. Another iteration of the concept model that we did further on, thinking of that building as one with that sense of sight and mass, carved into that place, and then the plans as they exist today, with the ground floor being education archives, all of the sort of support spaces, and then the upper floor being filled with natural light. Since it's a small building, a building of an existing condition, we know exactly which pieces will go in it, which is probably the first and only time in my career. There's a quality to those places that's very spiritual and powerful. We wanted the building to be one entity, to be one body, so that when you came through that grove of trees and entered the building, you really felt like you were held in a kind of body of earth almost. And that to bring light down into that then, and bring light through the galleries above and let it penetrate into some of the archival spaces below, we got to make spaces of particular proportion. They don't have to be flexible, so proportioning rooms for drawings and proportioning other rooms for art, the iterations in the structure itself, and trying to create a condition that had defined proportions and sequences and a narrative going through his career, but then a sense of space that unified that experience all at once with the upper galleries floors, which is what that is. So the light penetrating the galleries, the low galleries for drawings with no light, and then some of that light passing through to circulation spaces and archival space below. And then how to make a building where the body of the building and the light-emitting body of the building were one thing. So the entire building is site-cast concrete, including the screen of natural light that the light comes through that you'll see in a second. The lobby is a 150-foot cantilever, transferred by the slab. It's 10 feet high, so that when you walk in, you're compressed to the earth. Again, the sort of antithesis extending out into that canopy of trees. So it's a place of dark and mass, and then one rises up to the galleries, which are alternately, if they're the drawing galleries, they're connected back to the landscape with views. If they are the galleries for paintings, the diffused natural light is brought in through this site-cast concrete screen, which actually ends up forming the bottom web of the beams above. So they're actually structural, obviously reduced structure, but they're structural at the same time. Some of that natural light penetrating then back through. And again, the sense of connection and labyrinth that one experiences as you move through the whole building. The ribs of the steel are in those deeper ribs. There's two different forms of light. We worked with Arup engineers to create the specific quality of that light. It's very exciting. No one has ever seen these paintings in natural light. The goal, of course, is that there's very little electric light and that the light will change with the time and the seasons. Too many videos. We'll move on. The quality of the concrete itself, we've attempted to explore a process of making the concrete that we would ultimately not be able to control, that we would create a series of formwork that the end product then would be something that we could anticipate but not completely control. We created a series of boards, or we used a series of formwork boards that are both cut all the way through and lightly cut and then torn off, in which they bring the concrete with them. And so it has that sense of randomness and hopefully some sense of earth and geology that we strive for from the very start. All right. The National Music Center. This notion of amplification, sometimes it seems more appropriate to make an active building that is exclusive, or one should say that almost requires an exclusivity by the location or the nature of the activity. And in the National Music Center in Canada, we were given a site in an area called the East Village, which you can see it's in the upper white area. You look at the sort of proper end of city to the left, and then the area that they completely demolished in the 60s and 70s, where this building in the little blue squares is a gateway piece and a marker and a sentinel and an aspirational piece to try to reestablish this neighborhood. So again, going on drives, which is going on drives and walks back to the Richard Long, certainly some part of building in the West, but looking at both the landscape forms and the vernacular forms, I mean, Alberta is a very, very austere and powerful place. The Rocky Mountains are extreme to the west, rising almost straight up out of the ground. And then most of the state is prairie. But in southern Alberta, there's this area of hoodoos that you see on the left. This is all residual landscape from the inland seas. But an incredibly, incredibly powerful, absolute juxtaposition, just incredible juxtaposition and drama. And then this building is about music. It's establishing a place that represents the history and culture of Canadian music, which doesn't exist. So it's a brand new institution from a programming point of view, from an urban point of view, from a national point of view. And so seeking form, these are concept models that we did when we were pursuing the project, actually, seeking form that somehow stood against that landscape, asserted itself in the city, and then created this other world on the inside for one to explore music. This is the concept model that we took to the competition. Again, a kind of clarity and monumentalism with these individual acts of making that were roughly gallery and performance size, that each one of them would be different, have a different quality and a different character that one would only discover, would reveal itself occasionally on the exterior, and one would discover when one engaged that building itself. After winning the competition, I really wanted the building to be unified into one form, that rather than have the eight different elements. I wanted the building to have one form or one experience, and whereas the residual space in between was really the unifying the element, I wanted the structure to be able to unify it as well. And so how to do that launched us on an investigation of structure and a way of weaving this building back together, again, that only revealed itself on the interior. The building is 5 stories high. I can't remember how high it is. The building also has to bridge across the road to the other site, which has a historic building and the adjacent program of recording studios, offices, radio station, and then on the right side are the galleries and performance spaces of the museum or the National Music Center proper. So to unify the experience across the street, to unify the experience within the space, 2 different structural bodies, a kind of public body on the right where the 3 towers of galleries lift up and join in transfer beams of about 150 feet. And then a subsequent order, that interlocks with those that bear at the top, and the building essentially hangs down, or the performance piece then you see on the right there is suspended from the top about 5 stories above you. And so those 2 things interweave in the residual space and create, ideally then, a continuous experience of making. The ground floor, you can see on the right where the structure, again, just barely touches the ground, and on those 3 corners, and then where they bear in the resolved square. So when they bear their orthogonal plans, and when they do their structural business, They are modified by different form. And then continuous experience up to the 5th floor gallery, which you'll see in a minute, which bridges across the street. The lobby itself, where those rooms do not touch the ground, it opens up the performance space, which is an open space. It has operable partitions as well, bringing natural light down through those residual spaces. And then moving up to the galleries, the geometry changes and it shifts, where the ones go back to orthogonal and the other then take on the form of the structural joining itself. And then the stairs themselves occupy those residual spaces, these places of silence, and whenever one crosses, you can see across to the other stairs, occasionally see in the galleries, get that reference back down to the lobby, and then move into another one of the gallery experiences. We're exploring glaze again, wanting the building to have the quality of the earth. The gallery experience begins on the 5th floor, where we brought down the level or the walls of one of the galleries to open it up. So it provides a place of reference where you can see all of those different vessels, all of those different instruments moving around you in natural light. So, in closing, thank you for your patience. I think what excites me most about architecture, perhaps two things. Architecture as an act of insight, as a quest for understanding, perhaps rather than novelty, although they're not mutually exclusive by any means. But what excites me is approaching a project to really, with a sense of inquiry and openness, to ask a question, or ask the question of what architecture is possible in this particular condition. Not what architecture is appropriate, not what architecture is right, but what architecture is inherently possible there. I mean, it's exciting for me. It's exciting for me to look at a condition or a problem or a building problem and try to understand what it offers. That those particular conditions or consequences offer something to architecture that only architecture can amplify. And I believe that completely. That there are things that only architecture can render. There's understandings that can only be rendered by architecture. There are distinctions that only can be rendered by architecture. And then it is the opportunity that we have as architects to try to find those conditions and try to find those circumstances and ask them what architecture can do. And I think in many cases, architecture is not the answer. And in many cases, as I've learned in working with the artist can do it in ways that the architecture never dreamed of. We can participate in the same discussion as many other arts, but we can only do certain things because we build, because we are makers of architecture. And to me, that's, rather than a limitation, that's a kind of endless sense of wonder that we have the opportunity, and I would even say obligation in some way, to when we build, to pursue some level of insight and understanding that only we can offer the public as architects. I mean, when you do get to build, as I've been fortunate enough to do, you realize you're spending tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, 4 and 5 years of people's lives. We're actually just finishing a building for Pixar Animation Studios, and I learned in working with them that it takes 4 years to make an animated movie, which is about the same time it takes to make a building, and it takes 250 people to make a movie. And I would imagine close to a building. But I mean, it's a tremendous amount of effort and energy and resource, and so I think to feel, perhaps, and this is certainly true for me, a sense of responsibility and even an obligation that the building offers something that can't be experienced otherwise. Whether it offers a sense of wonder or awe or terror or ambiguity or whatever it is, there is that kind of that charge that architecture has, and the sort of joy that we get to do those things certainly is a continuing inspiration for me. So thank you all for coming. It's exciting to be here with my old Oregonian friend. I love saying that. He's a long ways from Oregon, this man. But thank you all for coming. Sure.
We'll take a few questions. I've got one or two that I'm prompted by what you're showing. The first, let's say, a question on landscape and one on the buildings and the projects. I mean, given the role that the landscape and your sensibility of the landscape plays in shaping your responses in the form of the buildings, there's clearly a kind of shaping of the ground that the object or the building then fits to that landscape with. I'm wondering if there are projects or if you've had opportunities to do projects that sort of make the project a landscape project, a kind of landscape proposal, whether it's a master plan or a larger scale intervention. And what I'm thinking of course, is a kind of land art sensibility in which the object itself becomes really a reconfiguration of the landscape.
Right.
That's the question about landscape. On the architecture side, what seems to run through nearly every project in some way is a kind of ribbon figure, the kind of winding of either a line or a plane that in almost every case is a very strong basis for what then becomes the formal organization of space and structure. And I'm wondering if you might say anything about a ribbon figure and how that seems to appear in the way it does.
All right. The first piece, the question of land art and earth. I've done some pieces that begin with the earth, as the first act of making, and some not. I can't think, other than the pieces that we've collaborated with GGN or Gussops and Porter, I haven't really done any. It's interesting working with Catherine. She's a master. In fact, her absolute ultimate strength is the earth. Her sense of grading is actually something. To create earth forms, a mile long, and understanding the spatial impact of those are beyond my understanding yet as an architect. So I think, conceptually marking the earth for things of a scale I understand. There's a discussion in the book with a landscape architect, Doug Reed of Reed Hildebrandt, who we work with a lot. So there's this notion of the earth and moving earth that I think we need a lot of work to understand, not necessarily the evocative quality of it. I think, architects can understand that, but there's a scale part of it. You're then engaging in a scale that is so enormous, physically enormous. And the perception of that is really, just making roads, working with Van Valkenburg on that site, and understanding how a road comes and how it works against the earth. It's extremely difficult. So I have a tremendous respect for it. But I'm learning a lot working with Catherine. Well, it's just a skill set. When you work at that scale, it's the same with planting. When you make an act of architecture that doesn't mature for 30, 40 years, it's kind of awe-inspiring. How does one anticipate? It's an interesting thing. In both of those cases, change becomes an interesting subject. And that's what's fun. That's what I've learned so much about with museums, because the art changes in them, especially like St. Louis, which has no collection. This notion of architecture as an incomplete act, even though it's made of stone or concrete or steel, that things act upon it and transform it in some way, that it's a kind of armature for change, even though it's immutable or reasonably immutable, I think is exciting. And I think in working with these other disciplines of art and architecture, landscape architecture, you start to understand scales of change and time that help me understand what we do as architects. The ribbon thing, which I would refer to more as a rhythmic thing, actually Ken Frampton was the first one to call me out on that, to tell you the truth. And I put a great quote in the book about rhythm that I found from an art critic. It's fantastic. I should have it in my head, and I don't because I drink too much gin. But the rhythmic thing really comes out of structure. Structure has a span, and you can do a lot to increase that span, as you've seen in some of the things, but it has a sort of limit in itself. And if you use structure as something that establishes some volumetric limit, it then gets repeated. Now, the way that we repeat it, oftentimes, actually, I wish I had this competition that we're working on right now in Lausanne, because I keep learning about this, but oftentimes it has that repeated rhythm that's open-ended because it's binding something, right? And I think it's a sort of discovered language in attempting to create an ambiguous boundary, and both bind something or bound something and be transparent at the same time. So open, closed, it has that kind of rhythmic quality. And then so many times you want to join the experience vertically. And so how do you create a continuity, Diller Scofidio did a long time with the I-beam, with the floor plate literally going through, even though it doesn't continue the experience, it graphically represents continuity. So how does one, that ribbon thing becomes an enfolding of space sometimes. It's interesting to try to work within the figure ground of structure as a positive that's open-ended and cantilevered, and then the volume, which is the opposite, and how it works through those things. I keep searching for ways to draw that and the play between the two. So I think it's a found language more than anything else.
There does seem to be a language connection.
It does, yeah.
I'd like to take some of the things that Brett has been saying in your response and perhaps push that a bit further. It seems interesting to me, the repetition that you describe and that you've shown, because if we take your relationship with Gustafson or with Balmori and others, you're working with landscape architects who are often quite gestural and can be really strongly gestural in that way, and yet the architecture doesn't fear it because, in a way, you're using this very strong attitude about the way in which form can come to reinterpret, dominate, amplify a condition, as you describe it, if it's conditional. And the language that emerges seems to me to be one that would be really appropriate to developing an urbanism. That is, you're playing with this idea of rhythm, with intersection, with span, or the increasing sizes and volumes in such a way that you could imagine you could handle many of the issues that come up within urbanism and problems of differentiation. And yet, so far, your work is really focused on the single building, and yet the language seems ideally suited to producing a kind of urbanism. And I've wondered whether you've reflected on that, and with our brief attempt to
it's really starting. We worked together briefly. We were in the finals for a competition in Shenzhen, Larry and I and Balmori. That's an interesting issue because, again, I sort of learn these things as I go, and if I think of the landscape like St. Louis and some of the others, it is a bridging mechanism in scale. That's why it's there, is to try to somehow mediate between the vastness of the city, right, and then the occupation and activity that happens within. That's why it always requires some other gesture, whether it's beautiful detailing or furniture or art or whatever else it is, because the scale. It's interesting. The Chicago Tribune art critic talked about St. Louis as one of the most monumental small buildings, and he questioned. It was also a criticism, which was actually, I think, very good, because you look at it, it's a tiny little building, and you go inside, and it has this enormous sense of space, and there's a disjunction to it, and again, that sometimes doesn't make sense even. Right, but it's trying to, if you look at that landscape of St. Louis, it's trying in that little bitty building, to your point, right, to somehow engage those issues. It's really interesting. Someone I know, I think Ken might even be doing, someone's going to do a superstructure show, or is working on a superstructure book, the sort of urbanism of superstructures. It'd be interesting to think of that again. Seems time to reinvestigate that. Almost as artificial landscapes, yeah.
I think the work is remarkable. It's amazing.
Thank you.
And a little bit, I see a current repetitive topic, a little bit about this extroverted interiority of the projects. And I have a question how, because I see your approach to the interiors, they're beautifully marked, these views from each single space, the openings of the building, and connecting that a little bit, that solution for urban fabric and those ties, do you kind of try to connect these interior spaces and try to bring this interior to the exterior to kind of connect the urban fabric? Like, because it's quite repetitive,
Yeah.
the approach from the interior.
Well, I think part of that is because I began in the West in those amazing landscapes. I mean, look at those places. It's incredible. So you're given those conditions or those sites and how where you want it, you sort of want it all, right? I mean, the classic sort of landscape house that's all glass looking out of the view. And yet, you in those conditions, I think for me anyway, I require a sense of reference. Like, how big am I? Where am I in the world that way? And so a lot of those projects struggle with that question of reference and measure, and how to allow yourself to engage those particular places, and still a sense of location, and, as a body. It's also really interesting in the book, in conversations with Ann Hamilton, the artist, and Doug Aitken, both of them very, very different artists. One very narrative and poetic, and sort of gorgeously sumptuous, being Ann Hamilton, and then Doug being God knows what Doug is, kind of high concept, high production. Both of them talked about the body, kind of beginning with the body as a reference point, which I thought was fascinating, really, really fascinating. And it's interesting because most of my work begins with like that, the scale of whatever, whether it's Columbus Circle in the park or the desert of Maryhill, but I realize I'm really just trying to work my way back, in some way, where as a physical person you can create some sense of understanding. I mean, it's interesting with it's almost like the architecture attempts to mediate or interpret the awe of the physical environment in some way, right? That you're just confronted with these things that are so overwhelming, right? And how can I begin to engage in an experiential conversation? I guess that's the other thing too. I don't begin, although there's a language that's arising, which there's no question about that. I don't begin with a form. In fact, I'm really not a very good form maker at all. I kind of find the quality of the space, determine what kind of structure helps serve the sense of space and transparency and boundary, right? And then begin working my way through that, and then I kind of end up with something. But I think when you're talking about that interior sense of space and connection, it's because it's really trying to think, what's the experience of this place or activity? Also, I just think being specific, being as specific as you can possibly be, right? I think it's one way for architecture to elevate itself, is just to be excruciatingly particular and specific to a place or an activity or a material, and in that way sort of justifies its existence, in light of any other means of artistic expression, I guess.
I'm wondering, concrete in a way runs from the very beginning site works through to what's now become, let's say, a much more plastic kind of sensibility, and maybe that's something about the, maturing command of that particular technology. But it is interesting that it's an architecture of cast form, much more than assembled elements. I mean, maybe the kind of tube house, the guest house in the Dutchess County, which is a line of space running through it. But for the most part, it's a very concrete, it seems, sensibility.
I think it's two things, and I think it has to do with structure as well. I think the idea that the body of the architecture is immutable. Like I said before, it costs so much money, it takes so much effort. It should be built in a way that it withstands time. And yet the space that happens in the activities are completely or sort of endlessly interpretable. And I think the spatial ambiguity helps serve that. In Columbus Circle, I don't know if it's material ambiguity or not, but the fact that the materiality of it changes in some way, and light, I think wanting the monumentality, sort of cultural monumentality of those bodies to be there, even if the activity and the art and everything else around it changes, right? That it's a sort of superstructure for the unknown in some way, but becomes a superstructure that way, that it's not a temporal act. And there's a sort of ethic in it, I guess, on my part. And then concrete can do so much. I mean, that's what you saw in the National Music Center, is learning what concrete can do, and then the software to push it, too. The software to really be able to both engineer it and draw it and do all of those things that one can do.
Coming back again to another one of these themes, the unity of space and structure that you're preoccupied with, and I think shows up even in the photographs you use of the natural landscape, where that shows up as well as in your architecture. There's a couple things I'm curious about, and it seems that on the one hand, there's possible to again take up my interest. There's an approach to urbanism that could be in that. But the thing that I'm particularly intrigued about is, how do you work as an office in order to begin to develop that unity as part of a drawing practice, and how do you also then bring in the engineers? Where you mentioned a number of times of using light engineers to help develop that idea, and I'm just wondering, is there a pattern where you work in order to reveal this unity of space and structure and light as kind of an office language?
Right. It's hard. What we end up doing a lot these days is learning a lot of the software ourselves. What the engineers have is analytical software. They can tell you what quality of natural light will hit this wall in this room on any given day, because they have all the data from the sky domes in almost every location, right? But how to then take that data and model it in some way, and I'm not just talking about daylighting software, but sort of model it in a way that gives value. And it's the same with structure. How to, because you've seen the sort of color-coded force diagrams that everyone uses now, right? But then how to take those things and begin to explore them, not just connect the dots, because they do those things and then they're done and they connect the dots, but begin to somehow explore them. It's generally not their profession. I mean, I don't mean to be critical, but they're solution-oriented, and they have all the tools now, and so we end up learning a lot of the software to try to work with them to just bridge the language of what we're asking for from them in the software. And luckily, the talent level now is amazing relative to how quick people can use those tools. It's kind of extraordinary. But it's challenging because we work with some of the best people, but it's still really hard. Really, really hard. Like, to work with those forms and want there to be, want to understand the logic of those forms. It's extremely challenging. Yeah.
Fred, thanks so much.
Sure.
Thank you for coming in. We'll see you again soon.
Sure.